They called him invisible, until he brought down the most powerful bank in the city. On the morning Halcyon and Rowe began to die, no one noticed the junior analyst in the back corner cubicle. No one noticed the way Ethan Vale stopped shaking. No one noticed him print a single page, slide it into a plain envelope, and write 6 words across the front in block letters. For when they start lying. By lunchtime, the markets were whispering. By evening, regulators were calling. And before the week was over, the men who had ruined lives from glass towers were staring at each other like trapped animals, trying to figure out how a quiet 26-year-old analyst they barely remembered hiring had turned their empire into a crime scene. It had started, like most disasters did, with something small enough to ignore. Ethan had been at Halcyon and Rowe for 11 months, 2 weeks, and 3 days. Long enough to learn that nobody looked directly at junior analysts unless they wanted a spreadsheet fixed, a coffee replaced, or a mistake blamed on someone too powerless to fight back. He was smart. The kind of smart that made people uncomfortable because it didn't advertise itself. No expensive watch, no polished arrogance, no rich parents calling managing directors by their first names. He came in early, left late, and learned very quickly that in investment banking, competence made you useful, but invisibility made you dangerous. Especially when people forgot you were in the room. Halcyon and Rowe was the kind of firm that filled magazines and frightened governments. Its chairman, Victor Rowe, was a legend in financial circles, a silver-haired architect of billion-dollar deals who spoke in calm, civilized sentences while destroying entire industries. The bank didn't just move money, it moved ministers, headlines, investigations. It made bad things disappear. And Victor's son, Adrian Rowe, was supposed to inherit all of it. Adrian was younger than Ethan expected the first time he saw him in person. Early 30s, immaculate suits, easy smile, a face built for apology and deception. He was the head of strategic acquisitions, but everyone knew titles didn't matter when your last name was on the building. Then there was Celeste Marin, Chief Compliance Officer. Sharp, elegant, unreadable. Most people feared Victor. Ethan learned to fear Celeste more. Victor won by force. Celeste won by knowing where every body was buried and which grave could still be used for leverage. And beneath them all were the people like Ethan, the invisible workforce, the midnight modelers, the exhausted associates and analysts feeding numbers into deals that made other people famous. Ethan had not planned to bring down an empire. He had planned to survive one. His mother's medical bills had been swallowing what little his family had. His father had died when Ethan was 17, leaving behind debts and a half-sold construction business. Halcyon and Rowe wasn't a dream job. It was oxygen. It was rent. It was chemo. It was the difference between his mother pretending she wasn't in pain and admitting she couldn't afford another round of treatment. So Ethan kept his head down until he saw the signature. It was just after midnight on a Thursday. The floor had emptied except for 2 associates pretending not to hate each other and Ethan, who was reconciling transfer records for an offshore restructuring deal involving a mining conglomerate in West Africa. It was routine in the way poison can become routine when served in crystal. He compared 2 files that were not supposed to conflict. One was an internal approval memo authorizing a transfer from a Shell subsidiary in Cyprus to a holding structure in the Cayman Islands. The other was a client consent package scanned into the archive. The signature on both documents belonged to the same man. But one of them had pressure marks, slight hesitation, human imperfection. The other looked copied, too smooth, too even. Dead. Ethan stared at it longer than he should have. Then he checked the timestamps. The approval memo had been filed 48 hours before the client consent was supposedly signed. He frowned, reopened the ledger entries, and found the transfer had already been executed before final authorization existed. He told himself there had to be a reasonable explanation. There wasn't. The more he looked, the uglier it became. Funds were being routed through layers of entities with no practical business purpose. Compliance exceptions had been waived on verbal approval. Deadlines were retroactively altered. Signatures repeated with machine-like consistency. Internal review flags were marked resolved without attached notes. Risk disclosures existed in one version of a file and vanished in another. It wasn't sloppy. It was systemized. Someone had built corruption into process. Ethan did what most frightened people do when they find something too dangerous to understand. He went to his direct supervisor. Mina Mercer was a vice president with tired eyes and the permanent expression of someone calculating risk in every room. She had a reputation for being hard but fair, which at Halcyon and Rowe made her almost saintly. He knocked on her office door at 1:13 a.m. "I think there's a documentation issue in the Kestrel transaction," he said. Mina barely looked up. "There's always a documentation issue. This one looks deliberate." That got her attention. He showed her the signatures, the timestamps, the transfer trail. For a moment, Nina didn't breathe. Then she leaned back and said very quietly, "You didn't email this to yourself, did you?" Ethan blinked. "No." "You didn't mention it to anyone else?" "No." "Good." Her voice had changed, not relieved, alarmed. "Mina, what is this?" She closed the folder and handed it back to him like it was burning her fingers. "This is the part where you forget you saw anything." He stared at her. "That's not an answer. It's the only one I can give you. You're telling me the bank forged client authorizations?" "I'm telling you," she said, more sharply now, "that people who ask the wrong questions here don't get promoted. They disappear. Careers vanish. References dry up. Lawsuits appear. Families suffer. So take the gift I'm giving you and let it go." Ethan felt heat rise in his face. "If this is illegal..." She stood up so suddenly her chair rolled back. "Illegal?" she said with a hollow laugh. "Do you know how many things in this building are illegal if you write them down plainly enough?" The room went still. Nina looked like she regretted speaking, but it was too late. Then she said the one thing Ethan couldn't stop hearing. "Some of us stayed alive by learning when not to be brave." Alive. Not employed, not successful. Alive. That was the first moment Ethan understood he was not looking at isolated fraud. He was looking at a machine held together by fear. He started collecting. Not in obvious ways, not the kind of clumsy whistleblower fantasy people imagine in movies. Ethan knew enough about surveillance, access logs, and legal exposure to understand that one wrong move would get him erased before he had proof. So he became patient. He documented discrepancies in harmless-looking notebooks filled with formulas and meeting reminders. He memorized file paths. He took pictures only when necessary, always from angles that avoided metadata traps. He built duplicate timelines at home on an old laptop that had never touched the bank's network. He watched who entered restricted folders right before exceptions were cleared. He learned that Adrian Rowe liked to use private deal vehicles named after birds. He learned Victor never signed what Celeste could bury. He learned Celeste's compliance team had two kinds of employees, the loyal and the trapped. And most importantly, he learned the bank's greatest weakness, its arrogance. Powerful people always assume danger looks like another powerful person, a rival firm, a regulator, an ambitious executive. They never imagine the threat is the quiet junior analyst carrying boxed salads into conference rooms while they discuss bribery exposure like it's a weather inconvenience. Weeks turned into months. Then came Mara. Mara Levin worked in forensic accounting on the floor below. Ethan knew her only as the woman who asked impossibly precise questions in cross-team reviews and never smiled at flattery. She had the kind of face people misread as cold because they mistook self-control for indifference. She cornered him in the stairwell one evening. "You've been digging into Kestrel," she said. Ethan froze. "I don't know what you mean." Bad answer. She held his gaze, Then, softly, "I'm trying to decide if you're reckless or useful." He should have walked away. Instead, he said, "Which one do you need?" That was the beginning. Mara had seen fragments too. A sovereign debt placement with fabricated environmental compliance. A pension fund exposure memo altered after investor sign-off. A chain of offshore transfers touching politically connected intermediaries nobody was supposed to name in writing. "I thought it was isolated," she admitted one night over stale coffee in a 24-hour diner 3 subway stops from the office. "Then I realized isolated is how they keep us from comparing notes." Together, the pattern sharpened. Halcyon and Rowe wasn't just cutting corners. It was laundering risk, coercing signatures, and moving money through ghost entities to protect clients whose scandals would have detonated if exposed. Politicians, oligarchs, contractors, campaign financiers. The bank didn't merely enable corruption, it engineered plausible deniability for it. And the Rows were at the center. But there was a problem. Proof enough to destroy an empire had to survive the empire's first attempt to destroy them. Mara wanted to go straight to regulators. Ethan said no. "They'll bury us before we finish the sentence." "You think waiting makes us safer?" "No," he said. "I think timing gives us leverage." So they waited. And then Nina Mercer died. Officially, it was a car accident on a rain-slick road outside the city. A tragic loss, beloved colleague, brilliant leader. Flowers in the lobby, black clothes, controlled grief. But Ethan had seen Nina 3 days before her death. She had stopped him outside a meeting room and pressed a flash drive into his palm so quickly it felt like an accident. "You were right," she whispered. His mouth went dry. "About what?" Her eyes flicked toward the corridor camera. "Everything." Then she walked away. By the time he got home and opened the drive, it contained a single encrypted file and a text note. "If anything happens to me, don't trust compliance, especially not Celeste. Ask why the Mauritius account was reopened." Nina was dead 48 hours later. At her memorial, Victor Rowe gave a speech about integrity. Ethan stood at the back of the room, fists clenched so tightly his nails cut his palms. Adrian found him afterward near the elevator bank. "Hard week," Adrian said, voice smooth with rehearsed empathy. Ethan nodded. Adrian studied him for a moment. "Nina thought highly of you." That surprised him. "She did?" A faint smile. "She said you noticed things other people missed." It was the kind of sentence that could be praise or threat. Then Adrian added, "In our business, that can be a gift, or it can get a person into trouble." Ethan met his eyes, and for the first time, Adrian's smile slipped. That night, Ethan decrypted Nina's file. What he found changed everything. It wasn't just evidence of fraud. It was lineage, internal correspondence, hidden ownership schedules, side letters, a private trust structure. One name appeared again and again under code references tied to the Mauritius account Nina had mentioned. Elena Rowe, Victor's late wife, Adrian's mother. According to public history, Elena Rowe had died 20 years ago and left her holdings to the family foundation. But Nina's files told another story. Elena had discovered the early architecture of the bank's criminal network years before. She had tried to sever assets, expose Victor, and protect minority stakeholders. Before she could act, she was declared mentally unstable, isolated from board matters, and quietly written out of key control structures. The Mauritius account wasn't a slush fund. It was a dormant asset protection mechanism Elena had created in secret, and Adrian had reopened it 6 months ago. Mara read the files twice. Why would Adrian reopen his mother's hidden account if he's part of this? Ethan stared at the screen. Maybe he isn't. That twist turned the whole story on its head. They had assumed Adrian was his father's polished heir, but the record suggested a private war inside the dynasty. Quiet transfers had been rerouted away from certain shell entities in ways that reduced exposure. Internal approvals had been stalled at the last minute. Deal teams close to Adrian had requested unusually detailed audit support on transactions that would later collapse under scrutiny. Not enough to make him innocent, but enough to suggest he was playing his own game. The next move came from him. Ethan returned to his desk one Monday morning to find a calendar invite from Adrian Rowe. No subject, no agenda. Private dining room, 8 p.m. Mara told him not to go. He went anyway. The restaurant was nearly empty, all low lighting and expensive silence. Adrian sat alone at a table by the window, jacket off, tie loosened, looking less like a prince and more like a man who hadn't slept in days. "You've been busy," Adrian said when Ethan sat down. Ethan kept his face blank. "I'm an analyst. Busy is the job description." Adrian almost smiled. "You're not as invisible as you think." "Then why am I here?" Adrian leaned forward. "Because my father is going to destroy you." Ethan said nothing. "He knows there's a leak. Celeste thinks it's in forensic accounting. I think she's wrong. But once they narrow it down, it won't matter. They'll pick someone and make an example." "You seem very informed." "I grew up in this," Adrian said flatly. "You don't survive Victor Rowe by being uninformed." He slid a folder across the table. Inside were board minutes, hidden compensation structures, and an upcoming liquidity maneuver that would move billions before a scheduled internal review. "They're about to empty the house," Adrian said. "When the first allegations hit, they'll ring-fence whatever they can offshore and leave everyone else holding the collapse." "Why are you helping me?" Adrian's eyes hardened. "My mother tried to stop him. He broke her piece by piece and taught the world to call it illness. Then he told me loyalty was the price of inheritance." He looked out the window. "I spent half my life becoming the son he could trust, the other half learning where to cut." Ethan felt the room tilt. "Why not expose him yourself?" "Because if I do it alone, I look like a son murdering his father for control." Adrian's laugh was bitter. "Maybe I am, but the truth needs witnesses, documents, timing, someone they never saw coming." "So that's me." "That's you." It was a dangerous alliance built on mutual hatred and partial truth, which meant it was still an alliance between liars. Mara hated it on principle. "He's using you." "Probably." "And you're still considering this?" Ethan looked at Nina's flash drive on the table between them. "They killed her." Mara's jaw tightened. "We don't know that." "No," he said, "but they wanted everyone to think asking questions gets people buried with flowers and speeches." He looked up. "I'm done being afraid in the way they taught us." The collapse began on a Thursday. At 9:02 a.m., an anonymous evidence package reached 3 regulators in 2 countries, a major investigative newspaper, and an external auditor whose prior report had been quietly modified under pressure. At 9:11 a.m., a second package triggered automatic release protocols to institutional clients whose pension funds had been exposed to falsified risk disclosures. At 9:17 a.m., Ethan sent one internal email from a generic secure account to 37 senior employees. Subject: read before the story breaks. Attached was a concise index of evidence, not the full archive, enough to create panic, enough to prevent the lie from getting organized. At 9:26 a.m., the newspaper published its first alert. By 10 o'clock, Halcyon and Rowe's stock was in freefall. By 10:40, the lobby was full of cameras. The trading floor moved from confusion to terror in under an hour. Phones rang without pause. Assistants cried in bathrooms. Executives shouted over one another in conference rooms with glass walls that suddenly made them look exposed instead of powerful. Ethan sat at his desk and kept working. At 11:15, Celeste Marin appeared at the end of his row with security behind her. "You," she said. People pretended not to watch. Ethan stood. She led him into a conference room and closed the door. For a long moment, she simply looked at him, not angry, impressed. "It was you," she said. "It was all of you," Ethan replied, a flicker in her eyes. "You think this ends with justice? You think the world punishes men like Victor Rowe? It punishes weak links, disposable links, people without protection." "You mean people like Mina?" That landed. Celeste's expression changed just slightly. "You have no idea what Nina chose." "Then tell me." She laughed once, dry and tired. "Truth is expensive, more expensive than you know." Then Victor himself entered the room. Even now, in crisis, he seemed terrifyingly composed. He closed the door behind him and looked Ethan over as if examining a defect in a product line. "I underestimated you," Victor said. "Yes." Victor ignored the insolence. "Name your price." Ethan almost laughed. "That's still how you hear the world, isn't it?" Victor stepped closer. "Everyone has a number." Ethan thought of his mother rationing pain medication, of Mina in that office, of Mara saying isolated is how they keep us from comparing notes, of all the invisible people who cleaned up the blood and called it administrative processing. "My price," Ethan said quietly, "is one thing you don't know how to give." Victor's eyes narrowed. "And what is that?" "Consequences." The door opened again. Adrian walked in, followed by 2 board members and outside counsel. It happened quickly after that. Emergency resolutions, suspension of authority, asset preservation motions, finger-pointing dressed as governance. Victor realized too late that the board had turned because the evidence made loyalty more dangerous than betrayal. He stared at Adrian like he was seeing him for the first time. "You," Victor said. Adrian's voice didn't shake. "You taught me from childhood that power belongs to the person willing to strike first." Victor lunged, not physically, but with his face, his fury, his full paternal poison. "You ungrateful little traitor." Adrian gave a thin, broken smile. "No," he said. "Just your son." It should have felt triumphant. Instead, it felt sick. Because empires don't collapse cleanly. They throw debris. Innocent people lose jobs. Retirement accounts suffer. Assistants and clerks and analysts scramble to survive scandals they didn't create. The guilty hire lawyers. The less guilty write memoirs. The dead stay dead. In the weeks that followed, Victor Rowe was indicted alongside multiple senior executives. Celeste cooperated, only after negotiating for herself with the cold efficiency of someone who had always known the final currency was self-preservation. International probes widened. Clients sued. Politicians denied everything. Archived interviews resurfaced and curdled into irony. Halcyon and Rowe did not survive in any recognizable form. Mara testified. Adrian vanished from public view after one brief statement acknowledging systemic moral failure, without once using the word family. And Ethan? Ethan became briefly famous in the ugliest possible way. The press called him a whistleblower, a saboteur, a hero, a traitor, a disgruntled employee, a symbol. People who had never sat in a fluorescent cubicle under a leaking vent wrote essays about courage, as if courage were clean. It wasn't. Courage was shaking while clicking send. Courage was knowing you might destroy your own future to stop people who had already monetized everyone else's. Months later, Ethan visited his mother in the small apartment he had nearly lost trying to keep her treatment going. She was weaker now, but peaceful in a way he hadn't seen in years. The television was on low. Another segment about the banking trials flickered across the screen. "You can turn it off," he said. She looked at him and smiled. "No," she said softly. "I spent too long watching men like that win." He sat beside her. After a moment, she took his hand. "Were you afraid?" He thought about lying. Instead, he said, "Every second." She squeezed his fingers. Good people usually are. After she fell asleep, Ethan stepped onto the narrow balcony outside her living room. The city glowed in the distance, all those towers still standing, all those windows lit by ambition, hunger, and compromise. His phone buzzed. A message from an unknown number. No greeting, no name, just one sentence. You missed one account. Attached was a screenshot of a transfer ledger. Mauritius. Recently active. Amount, 0. Account holder, E. Rowe Holdings. Status, control transferred. Ethan stared at the screen. A second message appeared. Some empires don't die. They change surnames. He looked up at the skyline, suddenly unsure whether the story had ended at all. Then his phone rang from the same unknown number. And after everything that had happened, Ethan Vale, quiet, overlooked, disposable Ethan Vale, did the one thing powerful people had taught him never to do. He answered. This is the end. Thank you for listening.
Select now another video in our series of family and company dramas. They are all powerful stories of people coming back stronger after they have been humiliated or hurt by family members or their management. Always make sure you stay strong. Let nobody ever tell you what you are worth. You know the best. Of course.